Okay, I welcome you to this other session on knowledge without a price, and we are still in this course, medical biochemistry, wherein today we'll be looking at the cell. Now, let's talk about the cell a little bit. Now, right down from basic education, that's maybe secondary school and high school, we were taught of two types of cells. First of all, they told us that every living thing comprised or is made up of a cell or cells, and that is very correct. And from basic knowledge, we're taught of two types of cell, that is the plant and animal cell, and we made mention of the cell wall, cell membranes, and other things. Now, let's look at the cell in details. Now, to begin with, the cell is the basic structural and functional unit of every living organism. It means that whatever happens as a result in the living organism, or whatever is sent out from the living organism as a waste or a byproduct, or whatever happens in the living organism begins from the cell. So everything about the living organism starts from the cell. So when we talk about the cell, we are talking about the organism in general. So the first thing you have to note about the cell is that it's where all the biochemical processes of life takes place. Now let's take, for example, an animal cell or the human cell. Now, when we talk about biochemical processes like maybe glycolysis, Krebs cycle, which leads to energy production, storage of food, and all the like, it begins from the cell to the tissues, to the organs, and other sort. So when we talk about the cell, in summary, we are talking about the basic structure and functionality of every living organism, and where all the biochemical processes of life takes place. Now, in the cell, there are so many things that happen. As I explained, there's energy production, synthesis of hormones, enzymes, and all the like. All that takes place in the cell. And even, for example, when we are sick, we take medications. Now, the effects of those drugs begins from the cell to the tissues to the then organs. That's how the cell is so important, because the first thing we have to notice that a group of cells is called tissues, and groups of tissues make up organs, and group of organs make up systems, and group of systems make up organisms. So you see that without the cell, there is no organism. In summary, now let's look at two types of cell. Now there are two types of cell that we are going to be looking at in this course or in this lesson. That is the prokaryotic and the eukaryotic cell. Now there is this question that people often ask: what's the difference between the bacteria and the virus? Because they'll tell you all living things have to breed. They give you a certain characteristics of living things. In fact, all living things have to breed, produce, reproduce, and all the like. But they will tell you also that for viruses, they are dead outside their host. So does it mean they are semi-living or living? We are going to look at it in detail. Now let's talk about the prokaryotic cell. Now the prokaryotic cell is, or they are cells that lack membrane-bounded organelles. That is to say, cells that lack membrane-bounded organelles, we are talking about the nucleus, we are talking about the mitochondria, all the organelles in the cell that have a membrane, it is absent. But now, in the prokaryotic cell, there is the absence of the nucleus. There is the absence of the nucleus, sorry, but there is the presence of the nucleolus. That is a prototype of the nucleus, which contains the genetic material of all the cells. Now, let's look at examples of prokaryotic cells, because most of the diseases, infections that we suffer from are caused by prokaryotic organisms. Now, prokaryotic organisms also are made up of different shapes and sizes. Likewise, for eukaryotic cells, as we'll see it in the lesson. Now, for prokaryotic organisms or prokaryotic cells, there are some cells that they are rod-like in shape. There are some which are spiral in shape. There are some which are oval in shape, and they have different names. Now, let's look at the ones which are rod-like in shape. They are called the bacillus. Now, the bacillus prokaryotic bacteria is one bacteria that is responsible for food poisoning in humans. Now, anthrax bacillus caused by the bacillus prokaryotic cell, or the bacillus bacteria, is responsible for it's responsible for food poisoning. Now let's look at the oval-shaped bacteria, or the oval-shaped cell, that is called the cocci. Now, most often we hear of gonorrhea, but we definitely or necessarily don't know what it looks like. Now, the Neisseria gonorrhea cell is a diplococci, and it's also a prokaryotic cell. So we see that prokaryotic cell have one or two roles to play in the diseases that affects man. Now, under prokaryotic cell, there are two types. We have the eubacteria and the archaebacteria. Now, The eubacteria are bacteria that are found in soil, but we are not going to specify, or we are not going to take note or expatiate more on that, because that is not the topic of our subject matter. You have eubacteria and archaebacteria. Now, archaebacteria are bacteria that are found in salt lakes, hot springs, and ocean depths. And now they have a high probability of affecting humans. Now, we tend to wonder, for example, the stomach has an acid with a pH of 2, and we're told that as when it's with that pH, it is very acidic, and whatever comes its way is likely to destroy it. But now, how come some bacteria survive at that temperature? Now, what next you have to understand is that there are certain water bodies which have such temperatures, and there are some bacteria that survive there also. There are some prokaryotic bacteria that survive there also. Now, the next thing we are going to look at is the eukaryotic cell. Now, let's talk about the eukaryotic cell. Unlike the prokaryotic cell, it has membrane-bounded organelles, because we said earlier that the prokaryotic cell doesn't have or has no membrane-bounded organelles. But for the eukaryotic cell, it has membrane-bounded organelles. And likewise, the prokaryotic cell, one other similarity between the eukaryotic and the prokaryotic cell is that they are made up of different shapes and sizes. Now, for eukaryotic cell, we're talking about the cells found in the human body. Now, you notice that the cells of the skin may be different from that on the eye, may be different from that at the neurons, and its shape and structure is directly proportional to its function. Now, for eukaryotic cells, as I said earlier, there are cells that have membrane-bounded organelles. When we talk about membrane-bounded organelles, we are talking about the nucleus, we are talking about the mitochondria, and all organelles that have membranes. And one thing we have to know about the eukaryotic cell is that the prokaryotic cell, is that its genetic material is stored up in the nucleus. The nucleus contains genetic material. And one thing that you have to note also in the prokaryotic cell is that in the eukaryotic cell, is that the mitochondria is one organelle that can function independently, because the genetic material in the mitochondria, the mitochondria produces its own genetic material, and the genetic material in the mitochondria is different from that in the nucleus. So the mitochondria can function independently. Now, let's look at some of these organelles in details. Let's begin with the nucleus. As I said earlier, all cells in the human body, don't forget this is medical biochemistry, we relate it strictly to the human body and see what alterations are there, and we study the cells. Now, first we have to understand that all prokaryotic cells, all eukaryotic cells contain the nucleus except matured red blood cells. Now, mature red blood cells have no nucleus, so they have no genetic material. No wonder mature red blood cells are being destroyed, because there is lack of continuity, because we have to understand that the DNA and RNA is what is responsible for the life of the cell and replication of the cell. So all cells have the nucleus except mature red blood cells. And what you have to understand is that DNA replication and RNA synthesis also happens in the nucleus, and the nucleus is one of the most vital part of the cell. The destruction of the nucleus is definitely going to lead to the death of the cell. Now, without much ado, we'll go to the next organelle, that is the endoplasmic reticulum. Now, the endoplasmic reticulum is one organelle that is responsible for the transportation of proteins and lipids. It's responsible for the transportation of proteins and lipids. And now they are made up of two types. There are two types under the microscope and under the electron microscope. That is the smooth endoplasmic reticulum and the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And one thing you have to notice is that the difference between the smooth and the rough endoplasmic reticulum is the presence of ribosomes. And now there's another type of endoplasmic reticulum called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and this one helps to transport molecules into and out of the cell. We'll see that further in this lesson. Now, the endoplasmic reticulum has a role and a responsibility in the transport of proteins and lipids throughout the cell, or between one cell and another. And I've already explained the difference between the smooth and the rough endoplasmic reticulum. So the next thing we're going to is the Golgi apparatus. Now, the Golgi apparatus has a main responsibility of packaging, sorting, and secretion of proteins. That is the main responsibility of the Golgi apparatus. Now, let's look at the lysosomes. Now, in school, we know of these big guys that are the bullies. and when there is any problem, we know that we are comfortable because they will come and do what they know how to do best, that is bullying and destroying. And that is what the lysosomes actually do. Now, they are called lysosomes because they have a responsibility to break down, break out, or destroy any particle that is trying to invade the cell. Now, they have very tough and dangerous phagocytic enzymes that helps to break down any molecule trying to invade the cell. That is the role of the lysosomes, and they do this by engulfing the particles and destroying them. Now let's go to another organelle that is very important as the nucleus. Let's look at the mitochondria. Now, the mitochondria is one organelle that one can function independently because it produces its own genetic material, and the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, meaning that whatever the cell does, it draws energy or it uses the mitochondria. So the absence of the mitochondria also has great risk to the cell, and certain drugs that we often take has a relationship or has something to do with the mitochondria. We'll see that further in this lesson. So the mitochondria, one, as I said earlier, is the powerhouse of the cell, meaning it provides energy for all biochemical reactions. Secondly, the mitochondria has its own DNA, and the mitochondria produces chemical energy in the form of ATP, that is adenosine triphosphate. Now, let's go to the next organelle of the cell, which is very important. That is the plasma membrane. Now, unlike the plant cell that we're being told that it has a cell wall that prevents molecules or prevents organisms from entering the cell, the animal cell or the eukaryotic cell, has the cell membrane. Now, the function of the cell membrane, it creates a difference between the intracellular and the extracellular environment, and also acts as a barrier preventing molecules from entering the cell without following the nature of the membrane. Now, let's look at this particular nature of the membrane. Now, if we go to study the fluid mosaic model of the cell membrane that explains how the cell membrane looks like, they will tell you that, or we'll discover that it's made up of a phospholipid bilayer, that is lipids which have the phosphate group with hydrophobic tails facing outward and with hydrophilic heads facing outward and hydrophobic tails facing inward. That explains why molecules which are not soluble in nature have a high probability of not entering the cell. Now, why won't they enter the cell? Because don't forget, the cell membrane is made up of hydrophilic heads which are facing outside and hydrophobic tails, and now cell and also particles which are strictly lipids won't have access to enter the cell. So particles which can enter the cell easily are particles which are lipid soluble with a touch of an aqueous environment, which gives them the high potency of entering the cell. But now we'll look at what happens when a molecule which is not lipid in nature needs to enter the cell. How does it add up? How does it enter the cell? Now, when we look at the cell membrane, we'll notice that there are other molecules which are in the cell membrane. We have glycolipids, we have glycoproteins, and we also have transmembrane proteins. And all this acts as transport molecules which helps to transport molecules which are not lipid soluble from the outside environment into the internal environment. Now we'll look at glycolipids, glycoproteins. We'll see that these are proteins which have the glucose molecule first of all, and one of their role is to transport molecules from the external environment into the internal environment. And we have glycoliproteins, we have transmembrane proteins, which their responsibility is to transport molecules from one cell to another. So that is how molecules which are not lipid soluble have access to the cell, although the cell membrane is made up of a phospholipid bilayer. So in summary, first, molecules which are only lipid soluble will face difficulties entering the cell because the cell membrane also has an aqueous environment. And molecules which are only water soluble will face difficulties entering the cell because the cell membrane has is made up of mostly lipids. So a molecule which will not encounter any barrier is a molecule which is lipid soluble and has a touch of an aqueous environment in it. And molecules which don't have access to the cell make use of glycoproteins and glycolipids, which help to facilitate the movement from the external environment into the internal environment. Now, we'll talk about molecules that are not lipid soluble. We'll talk about enzymes which are proteinous in nature. We'll talk about hormones which are proteinous in nature. So they make use of these glycoproteins and glycolipids and transmembrane proteins, which helps to transfer or transport molecules from the outside environment or the external environment into the internal environment. Now, one other molecule which helps to maintain the cell fluidity is called cholesterol. Now, cholesterol is one of the molecules that helps maintain fluidity on the cell of the cell. Now, what do I mean by the fluidity? It talks about the movement of molecules or the movement of nutrients throughout the cell. Now, it ensures that it doesn't become so concentrated that it leads to the lysis of the cell. Without much ado, we'll go to the next thing that talks about the transport of molecules throughout the cell. Now, we'll talk about the transport of molecules. There are two types of transport. We'll look at the passive transport and the active transport. Now, passive transport talks about the transportation of molecules without the use of energy, or energy in the form of ATP rather. But active transport is the reverse, which talks about transporting molecules with the use of ATP. Now, under passive transport, the first type of transport we look at is simple diffusion. And now, simple diffusion is the movement of molecules from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration, driven by the concentration gradient. Now, and this type of movement, there are no need for energy in the form of ATP, since as it is in line with the concentration gradient. Now, the next type of diffusion we'll look at is facilitated diffusion. Now, it talks about the passive movement of substances across the cell membrane, aided by transport proteins. Now, don't forget, when we're talking about the cell membrane, I made mention of the fact that molecules which are not lipid soluble but need access to the cell must make use of transport proteins, glycoproteins, transmembrane proteins, and all the like. And now that particular type of movement or transport rather is called facilitated diffusion. And now lastly, the last type of transport to look at is active transport. Now, active transport talks about the movement of substances from the region of low concentration, the movement of substances from the region of low concentration to a region of high concentration against the concentration gradient one, with the use of ATP. So in summary, when we're talking about active transport, the first thing that comes to your mind is that it is against the concentration gradient one, is from low level of concentration to high level of concentration two, with the use of ATP. And lastly, it also makes use of integral or transport proteins to aid in its transport from that low level of concentration to the high level of concentration. With this, I'm sure we are done with the cell and its organelles. See you in our next video. Thank you.